Joy Interrupted is an anthology, has over 50 contributors, and it covers all varieties of loss associated with motherhood, and it's structured around the 5 stages of grief. So it goes from denial, which I call no, to all the way to acceptance, and so all the pieces that are in it in some way reflect those stages to me. And so I'm going to read the introduction so you can get a better sense of the book, and then turn it over to Margaret in a second. Here's a quote from Nancy Burns at a TED Talk. "Joy and grief, that space between's not so far apart. It's actually intertwined. And I know that can be scary, I get that, but also can give you freedom. There's freedom in knowing you can carry joy and grief together." Like so many people have dealt with loss in their lives, I have been caught in the space between joy and grief since my daughter died of SIDS in 2003, and during my last 10 years struggling with secondary infertility. In the course of editing this book, I've learned that the space of grief and joy isn't limited to loss, but is part of the act of mothering. Despite barriers to biological motherhood, I will always be in the space of grief and joy because of my role as a stepmother. The conception of this anthology was inspired by my own grief journey. After the death of my daughter, I was so mired in pain and disoriented by my trauma that making sense out of my experiences was difficult. I found that grief can be myopic and lonely. Sometimes I couldn't see beyond my pain, and my pain was not always understood or shared by others. In trying to cope with the interruption of my joy of motherhood that occurred so dramatically after my daughter's death, I sought solace in writing and reading. Since deciding to be a writer when I was 11 years old, writing has always helped me to make sense out of my world. Writing has helped me locate myself when the ambiguities of life seem overwhelming. I sought solace in the works of others, trying to find other people whose joys of motherhood have been interrupted. I say interrupted because even with the death of a child, we do not lose our identities as mothers, our memories linking us to our children eternally. In trying to cope with this interruption, I wrote posts by women in online discussions who had also lost their children to SIDS. There are memoirs about motherhood and loss that were comfort to me, such as Gloria Vanderbilt's book, A Mother's Love, about her coping with her young adult son's suicide. At times, I wanted to relate to women who had similar experiences as mine. Women who were grieving the death of their infant, and then later, women who were struggling with infertility. Although not all spoke specifically to my own experiences, I was able to see how pain is pain, no matter the depth or the cause. I found that there were memoirs, novels, short stories, movies, anthologies, and more that told the tales of mothers whose joys had been interrupted, deferred, or delayed. Women who had miscarriages, daughters who talked about the pains of being adopted, women struggling with the loss of identity while mothering, men and women who were taking care of their dying mothers, and more. Seeing the varied dimensions of motherhood and loss was healing for me, helping me feel like I wasn't alone. Perhaps quixotically and naively, I decided to edit an anthology that dealt with the multiple dimensions of motherhood and loss. I thought it could be easily done in a year, and at first it seemed that way. Pieces from all over the world came pouring in about experiences similar and different from my own. The compiling of pieces wasn't difficult, but the actual editing process was challenging. Each piece was so poignant, moving, and intense that reading them over and over while editing them was often gut-wrenching. In approaching the contributions collectively, I found the process cathartic, but it also took a lot of psychic energy for me to face my grief and those of others repeatedly. Even though it was draining, I found going over and over the contributions aided in my own healing process. I was ripping the bandage off of a wound that had been poisoned by grief, bloodletting to survive. Editing the anthology also proved to be a paradigm shift. In collecting the contributions for this anthology, including artwork, poetry, prose, creative nonfiction, and flash fiction, I learned to see my experiences in a larger, more universal context. Some of these universal themes include coping with the death of a child, relationships between mother and child, including adoption and estrangement, caring for disabled children, and having to mother one's own mother because of an illness. I only had personal experience with a few of these situations. Reading about these varied experiences, real and imagined, expanded my consciousness about what it is to mother. In reading about other dimensions of loss, I saw new opportunities for coping, for making meaning out of pain, and for healing. I watched as the contributors process or didn't process their grief, and it helped me see that my own space between grief and joy was wider than I imagined, with me moving closer and closer to the other side of joy. The contributors to this anthology helped me, as Shakespeare wrote, give sorrow words. They sometimes said what I wanted to say, but didn't know how. And when they said things I didn't feel, my capacity for compassion grew. I felt connected to these contributors. My pain wasn't boxing me in the space of grief because I felt less alone. It is my hope that this anthology can do the same, some of the same for readers, allowing for movement closer to the other side of joy. I hope this anthology can reveal how each loss reaffirms the many possibilities of motherhood, even when joy is interrupted. While editing this anthology about motherhood and loss, I realized in every action of mothering, of being mothered, of wanting to mother, you live in a space between joy and grief, sometimes gravitating to one more than the other. This anthology reflects the space between joy and